Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for making it out relatively early. I have the task today of defining psychedelic business. I'm going to give a bit of a historical overview. Interesting, we're halfway through already, so you got a sneak peek. Okay, so this is the agenda. I'm going to start with the history. I'm going to give some examples of where psychedelics and business intersected in the past. Then I'm going to look at the present. I'm going to give a definition of psychedelic businesses, look at the last 12 months, which, as Kevin alluded to, have been pretty rough for psychedelic businesses, and then look at what we might expect to see in the next 6 to 12 months. First, I wanted to look at some historic intersections between psychedelics and business. It's definitely not comprehensive, and it's really geared towards the last century. But I made some timelines, and they're kind of overwhelming, so don't try and take it all in. But basically, the point being, if you look at this, you can see some logos of kind of evil big pharma companies that we all know and love to hate. So you can see Merck, Sandoz, which is now Novartis, GlaxoSmithKline. So the point of this is just to show that what we're seeing now is many small biotech companies and biopharma companies, little startups. But for a long time, big pharma was interested in looking at kind of every drug they could find and finding a use for it. And obviously, before the 1960s and 70s, with the thalidomide tragedy, the way that we did clinical trials was, you could just kind of, if you're a practitioner, you could just kind of give a drug to a mental health patient in a long-stay facility, or you could just kind of try things. So when we see mescaline being marketed by Merck in 1920, it doesn't mean it was an approved product. It just means Merck was producing it and shipping it out to researchers. And obviously, that's the same as what we saw with psilocybin and LSD, which were being distributed across the world by Sandoz. These companies were just trying to find a use. Ultimately, they didn't really find a marketable use, and that's obviously curtailed by prohibition. There's also other interesting examples on here. So in the case of mescaline and Ibogaine, we had some over-the-counter uses in the European sense, so kind of retail uses, where you could just go to the pharmacy, particularly in countries like France, and you could buy Ibogaine pills. You could buy mescaline on mail order, and it was made in Côte d'Azur and shipped out to you. So there's some interesting cases where psychedelics were just sold as products in a kind of commercial sense. Obviously, that came crashing down in the 60s and 70s with prohibition. But even into the 1990s, we see 2CB marketed as Erox, an aphrodisiac, in the Netherlands by a company called Dritavel. That kind of brings us up to today, where we have the only properly marketed psychedelic-like drug, which is Johnson & Johnson's esketamine Spravato product. And I think I wanted to dive into Ibogaine to kind of give more of a kind of understanding of why today is different from what we saw in psychedelic business before until now. So Ibogaine obviously is extensively used in West Africa, particularly Gabon. The Bwiti people, and before them, many other people indigenous to that region, have used it for ceremonial, ritualistic, medicinal uses. But it kind of made its way to mainland Europe when explorers, which I love how they're always called explorers in the history books, colonists, brought Iboga root back to France and back to Europe, and it was isolated and crystallized in 1901. And from there, it takes on this weird kind of retail market. So it's marketed as Ipeton, and before that, Lambaréne in France. And it's incredibly popular amongst post-World War II athletes who are looking for an edge. It's also popular amongst expeditionists who are going and hiking mountains for the first time. And it's also just popular, on the street amongst average people. If you were feeling lethargic, you could go to the pharmacy in France and get some Ibogaine pills, and it would kind of perk you up a bit. So there's these interesting uses, which obviously stop when, in the late 60s, Ibogaine is banned. It's actually, I think, first prohibited by the Olympic Committee under doping, but then eventually it falls under these more general bans on many psychedelics and psychoactive substances in the 60s and 70s. But that's not before Howard Lotsof comes across it with his friends in the 1960s, and he discovers by accident its anti-addictive properties, first in himself, and then he sees it in his friends. And that kind of starts a lifelong passion of Lotsof, who wants to develop and bring these anti-addictive properties to more people. That eventually ends up with NIDA starting their own investigation into Ibogaine, and Deborah Mash, who obviously has carried the torch for the last kind of 30 years, leading Ibogaine clinical research. But then I guess the point here being, look at what we see today. We see companies like MindMed, Demirex, which is Deborah Mash's company, now part of Atai, Delix Therapeutics, and Gilgamesh, all exploring analogs and derivatives, aside from Demirex, of Ibogaine. They're not exploring straight Ibogaine. Often these derivatives are even non-hallucinogenic, so totally non-psychedelic, we think. And why is that so different, right? Like, it's just totally different to the history of the research into Ibogaine. And I think it's probably because a lot of the patents expired on Ibogaine and even on 18MC, which is what MindMed were looking at. A lot of these patents are on shaky ground, or they're expiring or have expired. So I think beyond the kind of safety benefits there may be of these derivatives and analog, there's also, an important consideration for companies in the space, which is being able to protect the investment that you're putting into clinical trials. So yeah, I think this isn't linear, and I think if it was, it would show a better picture, but I couldn't fit it on one slide. But it kind of shows how what we've seen in the last kind of 10 years or even 5 years in psychedelic business is characteristically very different from anything we've seen in the history of psychedelic research or industry. But I didn't want people to think that I'm just saying that people were selling these Ibogaine pills and Merck were just shipping out drugs. A lot of it was happening in the context of psychedelic therapy. So as we think of psychedelics today being used as a catalyst in the therapeutic process, that was also happening in the mid-century, particularly on the West Coast. This picture here is Hollywood Hospital, not in LA, but in Vancouver, and that was run by Al Hubbard, who many of you will know, and J. Ross McLean. And they did very well out of this business. They were selling psychedelic therapy, or LSD therapy, for around $1,000, which is around 11 grand in today's money. And Al Hubbard bought himself this Rolls-Royce Phantom with the proceeds. Presumably, that could have been from his uranium smuggling and drug dealing. But we don't know, presumably from this. And in that mansion is Casa Mia, which is one of the most expensive mansions in Vancouver, and that was owned by J. Ross McLean. So they did very well out of this. It angered Huxley, who said in one of his letters about people like this that he has seldom met people of lower sensitivity and more vulgar mind. So I think we can say that Huxley wouldn't have invested in Field Trip Health or Awaken Life Sciences. But this mansion was actually, if you don't take anything else away from this presentation, the mansion was used as the interior set for 50 Shades of Grey. So a fun bit of trivia there. But now I'll move on to the present, because I'm not a historian. You should go read Erica Dick or someone who actually knows about the history of psychedelic research. But on the present, I've been covering psychedelic businesses and their kind of weird and wacky emergence over the past few years at Psychedelic Alpha. So I'm going to try and give an overview of what we're seeing today. And at least when I'm talking about psychedelic businesses, these are the kind of companies and kind of operations that I'm talking about. So down here with the kind of pink, kind of magenta shaded companies, they're operating in the kind of decrim, deregulated space, retreats, consumer packaged goods. I don't really cover those at Psychedelic Alpha because A, it's just hard to kind of get information on them, and B, it's not my expertise. As you can see, I'm a bit of a square. I'm not really in the underground. So I mainly focus on the medical model. And as you can see here, this is kind of a value chain that we have, and a lot of other people are using a similar schema. You can also map companies onto the patient journey view, so the kind of onboarding, prep, integration. That's kind of useful if you're looking at these new tech companies, so apps, EHRs, patient management systems. But for just a general overview of companies, this works quite well. So you have drug discovery and development, which is obviously the biotechs and biopharma companies. That's where the majority of them are sort of sitting today. But then you have these other fields, manufacturing, tech, provider training, clinics, and care delivery. And these logos are just indicative. In true BBC style, other companies are available. These were just kind of examples. But just to point out, underneath manufacturing, you'll see one company, IPCA, which is part of Onyx Scientific, or the other way around. Many of you probably won't have heard of them, but that's because they're an established drug manufacturer. So I guess the point is, as this industry scales, we won't just see kind of truly psychedelic companies or point solutions. We're also going to see bigger companies, bigger software providers, bigger drug manufacturers coming to provide services for the psychedelic space. And we're seeing that with CROs as well. So yeah, this is the general overview. And in terms of the money, almost all of the dollars are accruing to drug discovery and development. So this is some internal data we have at Psychedelic Alpha. And basically, we had to put all the other segments into one because they were just so small to fit on the chart here. But yeah, as you can see, drug discovery and development, even in 2022, where there's been more focus on infrastructure, is still severely outsizing other categories. But when we break out those other categories, we see that technology in particular is becoming increasingly popular as an investment category. Last year, we saw a lot of focus on clinics and manufacturing. But this year, it's been a terrible year for fundraising for psychedelic companies, but tech companies in the space have continued to be popular, and even more popular than last year. So obviously this is small in comparison to the money going to drug discovery and development, but it's still, I think, quite a convincing trend. So these companies that are benefiting from this funding, there's hundreds of organizations in the psychedelic space, many of whom are represented here today. Many different types of companies, for-profit, PBC, vertically integrated platform companies, but around 50 of those are publicly traded. And at Psychedelic Alpha, we mainly focus on the public companies, not because we think they're the best. There might actually be an inverse relationship between how much value a company has and whether they're public, to be honest. But mainly because they have higher reporting requirements. So, we can see under the hood. They have to periodically tell people what they're working on. So yeah, we basically focus on those companies. And those companies, when you put them all together, you get to a market cap of around $3.5 billion as of last month. Whereas if you look at the market cap of Pfizer, just one of these big pharma companies, is $264 billion as of last month. So just over 1% of the market cap of one big pharma company. So this is just meant to illustrate just how early we are. And obviously this doesn't capture a lot of the value in the private space and in the space driven by companies and groups like MAPS, who obviously aren't reflected in this. But still, on the public markets, we're still very, very small. So given that, who's backing these companies? They're very risky. It's very early stage. It's been a difficult year. Institutions, for that reason, generally aren't involved, with some limited exceptions. Most of the money is coming from these quasi-institutional groups, so VC funds, psychedelic VCs, some of whom I can even see here today, and funds investing in mental health, groups like Evolve, and in high net worth individuals. So we have Matt Mullenweg, who found WordPress, which my site and 40% of the internet runs on, Diplo, the DJ, Liam Payne from One Direction, the Tinder co-founder, and then also people like Peter Thiel, who I didn't put on the slides because it kind of gives some of us like a reaction. But on the public side, there's a weird amount of retail investors. So we did some analysis, and about kind of 70% of the freely trading stock is owned by people buying it on Robinhood and on their online brokerage account in Psychedelics. So that's 9 representative companies we looked at. So then we took 9 representative comps, so pre-revenue, early stage, small cap biotech companies trading. And it was closer to 10%, with the rest of those shares being held by insiders and institutions. So I have a thesis that this goes some way to explaining the chop that we're seeing in psychedelics, trading on the market, and also the downright weird reactions to news. So you'll see a company post what many people in the space think is kind of positive news, and the stock just plummets. So I think, we see these kind of strange reactions because a lot of people investing in these stocks are trading. They're not actually investing for the long term like you would normally do in a biotech. But yeah, I think this is part of the story. But kind of given that choppiness, let's zoom in on the last 12 months, and this is what it looks like. So the purple and pink is stock performance of an index of psychedelic stocks. The SPY is obviously the SP 500, which is an index that kind of tracks the US economy writ large, and the XBI is a biotech index. So as you can see, it's been a difficult calendar year this year for biotech in general, but psychedelics have outdone themselves. They've managed to have an even worse trip than the rest of the market. And this only shows the public market, so our data also shows fundraising rounds in the private markets as well. Now this does have a notable exception, which is a Thai Life Sciences announced a loan facility of like 175 million, but we didn't include that because it's kind of weird. But if you start at last January, you can see a very robust fundraising environment for basically the whole of last calendar year until October, when things really cooled off. And as you can see this year, it's just been incredibly slow on the fundraising side. But despite this, we polled investors in our kind of newsletter audience in the summer in our first kind of investor pulse survey, and they seemed remarkably positive. And what this doesn't show is when we disaggregated it by type of investor, the larger investors, those kind of quasi-institutional investors, high net worth individuals, actually showed even more optimism than the average, and they showed quite a lot of staying power. They were looking to invest a similar or larger amount in the next 12 months. Now, there's one caveat, which is that they knew that this would be published, so they kind of had an incentive to show that they were optimistic to try and get other people excited. But also, yeah, I think it is interesting. People I speak to seem to think that things were very frothy last year. They were kind of investing at bad valuations, whereas now they have a chance to get a bigger slice of a company for a better valuation. So I think it's not all negative. So how are companies going to ride this out in the next 6 to 12 months? I think on the more kind of boring corporate side, there's going to be cost cutting. So this is our analysis. The yellow companies are the smallest public companies in psychedelics. The red are the largest. And the deeper the line, the more they're spending. So it's their quarterly cash burn. We equalize the y-axis so that you can see them compared. But as you can see in yellow, the smallest public companies are really having to rein their costs in. So things like the ridiculous $1 million marketing budgets are having to really be pulled back. Whereas larger companies like Compass, Atai, they're continuing to deploy cash. There's a slight drawback, but they're moving into later stage trials, so they're continuing to spend. Obviously a big way of cutting costs is to drop an entire program, so to drop a molecule from your pipeline, and we've seen even large companies like Atai and MindMed doing that, like with 18MC, MindMed shelved it. So that's another way, and obviously the worst case scenario is you go bust. And we've seen this happen a few times this year on the public markets. And in the private markets, we've probably had quite a few companies cease operating that we just kind of haven't heard about because they've done it quietly. But the flip side of this is that when things are bad, it's obviously a fire sale for some companies that are in a better position. So there's actually talk at the moment of a company being acquired by another psychedelics company. And we've seen some limited kind of intra-industry M&A with companies acquiring phase 1 trials or licensing compounds. Okay, done with the corporate stuff. There's also stuff to be excited about on the R&D side. So obviously the leading trials, MAPS's second phase 3, MDMA for PTSD, which you all know about. Compass Pathways just announced yesterday that they're moving into phase 3 by the end of the year for their psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And Usona Institute is in phase 2B of psilocybin for MDD. So these are all super exciting. And then behind this, we have this huge bulk of kind of phase 2, phase 1 preclinical discovery trials. And this image here is from our drug development tracker on the website, which is maintained by Michael Hyken, like heroic effort to try and keep track of all this work. I tried to paste it into the slide, but it was like 40 slides deep, but it's huge. But I have a bigger question about how much of that work is actually going to see it through to publication or utility or fruition, given how difficult the fundraising environment is. And also, the cynic in me, I'm a Brit, so I'm always cynical, is that a lot of this work was just for the purposes of press releasing. I think some of these companies kind of came out, raised money, were like, look on clinicaltrials.gov, there's our phase 2. And then kind of worried about it later, once they had the money, what they were going to do. But I think, the IP landscape's become more apparent. Patents are secret for 18 months when they're published, until they're published. So I think, there's a confluence of factors that mean that probably a lot of this work might not actually make it through to fruition. So I think that's going to be something to watch out for in the next 6 and 12 months, which trials kind of quietly stop. Beyond that, we should expect more of these blockbuster studies like the psilocybin for alcoholism study that came out a few weeks ago. And also, stuff that's totally beyond the drug development realm. So Tony Boses at NYU has the religious leaders study, which is super interesting, giving psilocybin facilitated mystical experiences to rabbis, imams, priests. And whilst that seems entirely kind of academic or fundamental research, having a more granular understanding of the mystical experience in itself, might be translated into clinical settings. So I think these studies are cool. Also, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and look at Tony's study, in the condition, it usually says like PTSD or like some form of cancer. But for his, it says a religious or spiritual problem, which I just think is like something we should be proud of in the psychedelic space, that we have things like that on clinicaltrials.gov. And kind of aggregating up from these individual trials to watch out for. I think there's trends and tensions that are going to continue to be salient. There's only 7 here, and I'm not going to go through them. I don't have time. But one, I guess, I could touch on skipping the trip. So this idea of non-hallucinogenic psychedelics. Obviously, the big question is, do they work? At the moment, they've only been tested in animals. But I think in the next 6 to 12 months, we might see some of those entering the clinic. So I think Delix Therapeutics is planning on having a phase 1 in humans in that timeline. But kind of even if they do work, I think people like David Yaden have raised ethical arguments around, if these work, is it right to deprive someone of what we know might be among the top 5 spiritual or like meaningful experiences in their life? So there's ethical questions around that. And there's also other researchers like the Stanford group and the Wisconsin group who are looking at using innovative trial designs to work out whether we can pair out the kind of subjective and therapeutic effects. So I think this is going to be an interesting area to watch in the next 6 to 12 months, whether we can pass out the two. And maybe, because I am weird, I'll say about weird trials, so the overrepresentation of people like me, white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people in trials, and presumably presumably after commercialization, we're going to see some of that as well, just because of how health and equities. So I think at the moment that's a trend in trials, and I hope that it continues to be a tension within the space, so that trial designers and sponsors are thinking about having more representative trials. And then on the policy side, so it was kind of touched on by Julie and Kevin, but there's a lot of kind of policy-related activity. Obviously, there's been a lot of buzz lately about the federal task force. Now there's buzz about Biden with cannabis. But we've been tracking this, so Graham from Calyx Law, who's here, and Sean Clancy at Emerge Law help us, and all of their teams actually, help us keep track of policy reform through this map on the website. And as you can see, at first glance, it's kind of quite bipartisan. It's not just the kind of coastal states. But when you look at states like Texas, usually what they're doing is establishing state working groups and funding research into the potential of these substances. Whereas on the coasts, we're seeing actual kind of decrim and legalization like in Oregon. In the UK, we have ILAP, which is our kind of post-Brexit equivalent of the breakthrough therapy designation. And it's been given to, I think, either 5 or 7 psychedelics companies, a lot more than the BTD in America. So that's kind of exciting. And in Canada, obviously, we have all of this buzz around the special access program, but we're kind of yet to see how expansive that's going to be. At the moment, it's quite limited. But even within policy reform, there's a lot of debate. So I deliberately didn't put Colorado up on the screen because it's not a debate that I want to wade into. But obviously, there's a lot of debate in Colorado about the 2 competing initiatives there. But I will wade into the decrim nature debate because I'm stupid. But obviously, there's debate within the decrim movement because what might seem intuitive, which groups like Decrim Nature are generally saying, I know they're federated, but generally saying, is that we should decriminalize all natural-based or naturally derived psychedelics, which sounds simple and neat, but it belies the fact that obviously some of these plants that produce these medicines, like peyote, are endangered and obviously have important spiritual importance for many different indigenous folks. So I think there's a good case to be made for doing what Scott Wiener actually did in California and excluding certain natural plant-derived psychedelics from these ordinances. And then, I've put the picture of Scott Wiener there on the strategic side because he found in California just how difficult it is to pass this when you're a kind of policymaker as opposed to doing it from ground up. His bill to decrim psychedelics across the state was obviously first they stripped out ketamine, which I don't think many people were too upset about. But then they started taking out the expungement clauses, to forgive prior convictions. And ultimately, by the time it got to the assembly, I think, it was, totally gutted, and the whole thing was just taken to pieces. So there's interesting things around, how pragmatic should we be versus idealistic. I study politics, so this is obviously, goes right back to the hippies. Some of them thought that we should build tomorrow today and kind of build a new world in the husk of the old, whereas others of them, I can't remember the name of the campaign, but there was this campaign where hippies should cut their hair to try and get this guy elected. But basically, they were like, we're never going to get him elected if we go around knocking on doors with long hair. So there's big differences between idealism, pragmatism that I think we're kind of seeing emerging in this policy reform effort as well. And then there's just the kind of semantics issue, which is this article from Now This News, which is a kind of millennial-focused publication of Vox Media Group. And the title is Shrooms Are Now Officially Legal in San Francisco. And this was in response to the kind of decrim in SF, where the law enforcement priority of arresting people for taking and distributing psychedelics was made the lowest. So it's very different to legalization. You can't sell psychedelics or shrooms in San Francisco. And this may seem pedantic, and actually I was complaining at people being pedantic at first because I said in the bulletin that things had been decriminalized or whatever, and someone was like, wow, it's actually lowest. And I was like, okay. But actually it's important, right? Because, if someone reads this and they don't know all about the different levels of statute and everything, they could end up, running afoul of the law. So I think it is important that we're clear about the extent of these legal reforms. And then I guess this kind of brings me to my meta-narrative for my talk, which was kind of like following this period of unabashed exuberance that we've seen over the last, the year before last, where, public companies were emerging from left, right, and center. There was a huge amount of excitement. We're now seeing critiques draw focus. And I think, a lot of people in kind of the people that I speak to, like investors, are kind of upset about this, and they're kind of sulking about it, and they're like, oh, I'm down 90%, and everyone's talking about expectancy effects. But I think it's actually a good thing, right? If we're going to have a sustainable, not just business model, but also a sustainable therapeutic container and practice, it's important to deal with these critiques. And I've just listed 7 here, but all of them are incredibly important. I don't have time to go through them, but maybe one I'll talk about is this trying to fit this psychedelic peg in a very square hole, which I think Julia kind of alluded to. And the square hole is our existing prevailing healthcare system with all of its issues, quirks, and inequities. And we're trying to take something that's ineffable and it's idiosyncratic. Everyone's psychedelic experience is different and sometimes difficult. And we're trying to squish that into health economics and payers' expectations. So I think that's going to cause a lot of tensions in the coming years. And I'm happy to talk about any of these I didn't get to in the Q&A. But just to wrap up, over the last 2 years, I've been trying to think of how to articulate this, and I tried to articulate it at ICPR, but not very well. But basically, I have this idea of the issues that we see in the psychedelic space, in industry, economy, academia, society, culture, policy reform. A lot of them, I don't know, there's a tendency to think of them as psychedelic-specific issues. But really, they're usually caricatures, in my opinion. They're like particularly grotesque examples of issues that we have in society at large, in industry at large, and academia at large. So take the example of psychedelic patents or patents. They seem particularly grotesque, right? Because someone's trying to put a moat or a monopoly around something that we think's existed in the public domain for tens, hundreds, even thousands of years in the case of indigenous folks. So it seems particularly painful, and it's frustrating, to see that the patent examiners aren't able to find the prior art and everything. But the reason these patterns exist is because if we zoom out, it's because of the incentives of the way our economy is structured, the pharmaceutical lobby, and there's a group called IMAC, who I think someone's here today, who are doing a lot of work on the link between drug pricing and patents. And so there's all these kind of meta issues within which psychedelic issues are nested. And the point isn't that we shouldn't bother because we're never going to change the world, but rather it's all this discussion about psychedelic patents and ethics and equity in the psychedelic space. I think there's a lot of latent energy, like in this room, to do things differently and not to fall into the same kind of tracks and the same kind of ruminative tracks as the broader kind of society that we live in. So I think if we could take 10% of the energy we have about making the psychedelic space more equitable and using different business models, and take that to other areas of our personal relationships, communities, societies, and practice, like your professional practice, take the ideas and spread them to other areas of your life. I think that is a very vague and big task, but I guess that would be my push to everyone today, to try and think about how we can take this energy to other areas of our life. So with that said, let's get to it. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josh. Just a reminder for anyone who came in late, at the other side of your badge, you can submit questions, and I will find them here on this iPad. I'll kick us off. So as we've seen, we're at the other end of the hype. And I'm very curious, what's your view on what caused those inflated expectations? And related to that, what needs to happen to correct for them?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think Tassin Narani, who's a great researcher from the UK, he described it as the pollen effect, which was the heightened expectancy that people had going into clinical trials. So I think there's a lot of heightened expectancy and hype even among clinical trial participants, not just what I cover, the public markets. But yeah, I think Pollen's book was important for bringing psychedelics back to the mainstream, but kind of unintended consequence, right, is that there's kind of an over expectation that there will be this kind of silver bullet. And I think you mentioned it, that in Western society we do have this kind of obsession with the one weird trick, like doctors hate him, he has this one weird trick. And I think that kind of feeds into this hope that there is this drug that will get us out of this mental health crisis, when in reality we need to do a lot of work on the kind of structural side. And then I think in the markets, a lot of people lost a lot of money in weed stocks. So we did some analysis where we compared subreddits, so different like Reddit forum boards, and we compared the people who are in the Shroom Stocks Reddit, which is the most active psychedelic investor Reddit. We saw where else they're interacting on Reddit, and almost all of them were active in weed stocks. Some of them are actually really active in antinatalism, which is the philosophy of not having children. And my thesis is not because of some like philosophical comparison between psychedelics and antinatalism, but because they lost their kids' college fund investing in these stocks. But yeah, that's my answer.
Makes a lot of sense. You say that you're really exclusively focusing on the public companies, right? I'm curious, how do you think that legalization will impact medicalization and the health and growth of the sector in the long run?
Yeah, I think, so we focused on public companies and reporting just because there's more information. But yeah, as I said, I think the private companies are doing, just as much interesting, if not more work. But in terms of, this intersection between legalization and decrim, I remember back in the day when public company CEOs, like I think maybe MindMed CEO at the time, were happy to come out and like directly oppose decrim. So like they would do these roundtable discussions or like investor like public talks, and they would say that they're against it because it's dangerous and everything, and you need MindMed LSD, like you can't just go out and take any LSD, and that was kind of the zeitgeist for a time. But then I think, they got a lot of pushback from people who were invested in psychedelic companies who were like, no, I'm actually, for decrim, and like I want to end the war on drugs. So now most C-suite psychedelic company folks will say, we support decrim and legalization. And kind of the narrative is that there's going to be these two kind of divergent paths towards psychedelic use. One is obviously policy reform, and one is medicalization. And they probably, I don't know, I don't think they will, I hope they won't infringe on each other at all. But I think there's just, very different groups of people. So my parents, for example, haven't taken psychedelics and wouldn't. They wouldn't go to a retreat center. They wouldn't go to like a underground clinic. But if their GP suggested it, their doctor, and if it was paid for by the NHS in the UK, then I'm sure, they would consider it like they would any other therapy. So I think that's how I kind of see it emerging. We're going to have the medical model, and some people are like that. And maybe over time, as people experience psychedelics through the medical model, they'll be willing to go through the kind of underground or decriminalized context. So maybe the medical model will just kind of put itself into obsolescence, ultimately. That would be cool. I think it's very optimistic, but yeah.
So staying on that topic, let's move to audience questions. There's only one, don't be shy. But it's on our topic. Can you explain the different strategies for decriminalization versus the FDA pathway? And I think this question is coming from a therapist, specifically with the context of around, the FDA model, benefits and reimbursement, et cetera, is still so unclear.
Yeah, I mean, I can't explain the different decriminalization models. I'm not smart enough, I'm not a lawyer. But in terms of the difference in outcomes, that's the main one, right? Like an insurance company can't reimburse. For example, in Oregon with the psilocybin therapy, insurance companies, from what I understand, can't or aren't going to reimburse that. So it's going to be paid out of pocket. And that's, the main, if not like the only big benefit of the medical model, which is obviously FDA-approved drugs tend to be covered by at least some insurance companies here. And obviously, the insurance company makeup in America, I don't really understand it, but obviously there's lots of different actors. One of them might lead the way and kind of, take up psychedelic therapy. Whereas in the UK and the EU and also in other countries where they have, single state healthcare payers, I think, if we get one of them on board, you could see a huge kind of increase in access, right? Like imagine if the NHS or, some state governments in the EU, like Italy, for example, imagine if they decide to cover psychedelic therapy. It's a huge, market's a kind of crude word, but it's a huge, population that's going to have access to it very quickly. Whereas, obviously in decrim context, it's all out of pocket. So, yeah.
And we'll hear more about that topic in detail a bit later, so stay tuned. Josh, if you were given this presentation in 10 years, what trends and trajectory do you imagine would happen?
In 10 years from now? So I think we wouldn't see as many molecules at market as we see at the moment on that like drug development tracker. I think at the moment, and especially last year, among investors, there was like a huge focus on new chemical entities and like just tweaking the drug. But I don't know, I'm kind of now coming to the thesis that these modified versions are going to have, especially if you're just modifying psilocybin, but you still want it to kind of basically act like psilocybin therapy, they're going to have quite a lot of like additional benefit, right, in order to justify, spending the hundreds and hundreds of $1 million to bring them to market. So I think a lot of that stuff will be stranded. There'll be like stranded assets, and maybe in 10 years we'll be looking back and being like, how did we get into this situation where we kind of believed that these entities would be, this huge big thing? I think some will. But in terms of trends in 10 years, that's a hard question. I mean, I would hope that we had, multiple psychedelic therapies to market, and maybe the question in 10 years would be, how do we best choose, the best people to take the best drugs? Like, if someone presents at the doctor's office, what's the clinical management system that we're using, decision management system, to decide, which is best for them? Should they start with MDMA therapy? Should they start with psilocybin? Should they take this daily non-hallucinogenic version, which more resembles like an SSRI? So I think hopefully that's what we'll be deciding in 10 years, right? We won't be looking back and saying, where did it all go wrong? Yeah, that's what I would hope.
Looking at the value chain, you really laid out the verticals for us. We have someone asking where in that landscape you see the most need and opportunity for entrepreneurship and investment.
Yeah, I think everything other than drug discovery at the moment is of interest. I think investors are kind of tired of having to try and understand why this pipeline of molecules are interesting. I think there's some early stage biotechs that have a lot of buy-in from investors, and they've kind of demonstrated that what they're working on is exciting. But I think for new companies, that's why we're seeing so much investment in tech. Because now people are starting to think about, how do we actually build out this infrastructure? How are we going to, scale up care? How are we going to do things like manage all of the stuff that happens between the therapy sessions? So, app-based, not integration itself, but help with integration. And also just stuff like coding and reimbursement, I think is super interesting at the moment. Because even if we find enough, therapists to train in psychedelic therapy, we still have to make it worth their time. Like every morning, there's the decision, next Monday, do I want to do 7-hour-long therapy sessions with clients, which might be more interesting, right? They're speaking to 7 clients, they're really practicing their skills and their passion. Or do I have one psychedelic-assisted therapy client? And I don't know anything about therapy, I'm not a therapist, but to me, that seems like we have to make that equation work. And some of that is making sure that therapists get paid well and get paid quickly. So I think everything on the kind of reimbursement and the boring kind of nuts and bolts side, I think that's super important to invest in or fund or raise money for at the moment. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh.
Thanks. Thank you.